Okay, the last speaker in this session before the discussion is Dr. Margaret Moline, who's the Executive Director, Head of Orexin Platform Clinical Development, and the International Project Team Lead for both the lemborexant and orexin agonist clinical development programs at AC Incorporated. Sai.
Yes, Azai. Thanks. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join with you today. So we've heard a lot about
You want your own slide?
Could be good. I mean, I can talk about insomnia treatment ad hoc, but I think you probably want to see my slides instead. So we've heard a lot about the importance of sleep. This is audience I'm preaching to the converted. We've heard about the health risks for short sleep. We've heard about disparity in treatment and so on. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is a little bit different. I'm talking about the impact of scheduling on treatment decisions. So hopefully you'll see how it ties in some of the threads that we've been discussing earlier before my presentation. Okay, so here is my disclaimer. I work for Azai, and these are the views and opinions are mine and not necessarily reflecting official policy or position of Azai. Next slide, please. Okay, so insomnia is a very common sleep disorder that increases in prevalence as people get older. And you've heard about the consequences of short sleep quite a bit today. And it's associated with clinically important comorbidities, hypertension, mood disorders, as we just were hearing from Dr. Crystal, metabolic disorders, as you heard from Dr. Z, cognitive difficulties, and so on. So as first-line therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia is recommended by clinical guidelines. And we heard about the effectiveness of CBTI just now from Dr. Crystal. There are some limitations with CBTI that in terms of access, cost, adherence, and importantly, a lack of trained clinicians who can administer the therapy. Fortunately, there are online CBTI programs that are available, but they may not, but CBTI in general may not work as well for patients who have objective short sleep. So that means that there needs to be another therapeutic option available, and then we go to look at pharmacotherapy. So in the United States at the moment, the most commonly used drug to treat patients with insomnia is trazodone. Trazodone is not approved for the treatment of insomnia. It's a well-known antidepressant that's not, but the prescriptions, the vast majority of prescriptions for trazodone in the United States are not written for patients to treat their depression, but rather to use a much smaller dose for insomnia off-label. The other major drug is zolpidem, which was one of the BZRAs, a Z drug. The dual orexin receptor antagonists are the most recent class of sleep-promoting drugs that have come to the market, but they're used much less frequently. Now, when determining what pharmacotherapy to use, there's always going to be a balance between efficacy and safety. So I'm not focusing on efficacy today, but rather on safety and how the impact of scheduling plays into that. So it's important to know that not all of the Z drugs treat both sleep onset and sleep maintenance problems, which are commonly reported and not necessarily the same from night to night in a patient with insomnia. And as I mentioned, trazodone is not approved to treat insomnia. The safety concerns associated with the Z drugs include, among others, tolerance, dependence, rebound insomnia, daytime sedation, falls risk, potential respiratory depression, memory and cognitive difficulties, and aberrant nocturnal behavior for which there are black box warnings. And you can see these in the full prescribing information of these drugs. What's important also to remember is that these drugs require a gradual discontinuation so that in the case of an emergency, it might be a safety risk for the patient because it could be very problematic for them if they need to be discontinued for some reason. And also, these drugs are not recommended for use in elderly. Insomnia is very common in elderly patients. They're not on the Beers list for important reasons. And you can see that some of the adverse events that are very well known play into abuse potential. The safety concerns with trazodone for insomnia are not as well articulated. It's not a scheduled drug, but it hasn't been tested specifically for insomnia with the same large-scale, well-controlled studies you would expect for something that has been approved more recently. It's also associated with daytime sedation and psychomotor impairment. Now, the DORAs also come with safety considerations, the most common being the reports of somnolence, headache, and nightmares and abnormal dreams. So when it comes to scheduling, the abuse potential for the Z drugs is well established. Zolpidem is used in human abuse liability studies that determine abuse potential for hypnotics. The abuse potential for trazodone, on the other hand, it has not been established. And you can see language that I lifted from the full prescribing information. It wasn't studied formally. It's because trazodone was approved years ago before the more recent strategies for assessing abuse potential were set forth. But in these clinical studies, the language in the label says that there's no indication of drug-seeking behavior in the clinical studies of trazodone as approved as an antidepressant. In the literature, there are some reports of abuse, but there really is very little information that's known about it. As far as the abuse potential of the DORA class, DORAs are dual orexin receptor antagonists. I'm sorry, I work with these all the time, so I should have defined what they are. So the Z drugs work through GABA, and the DORAs work on the orexin neurotransmitter system. They work by decreasing wakefulness at the time that the patient wants to sleep. So fundamentally different way of dealing with insomnia. The BZRAs are increasing the sleep drive, basically, and the DORAs are decreasing wakefulness via the orexin system. So the DORAs were studied using zolpidem as an active comparator. And in these studies, one looks for a patient population, recreational sedative users. So the ones that are using the drug for the sensations that they get when taking them for that purpose. And the subjects are identified by being able to detect the substance that is the comparator. So in the case of lemborexant, for example, the suvorexant was already on the market. So the drugs that were, the comparator drugs that were used were zolpidem and suvorexant. So the subjects would need to be able to like and recognize both suvorexant and zolpidem. And in these studies, there was no difference between the active comparators and the test drug, in the case that the example I gave you, lemborexant, as far as drug liking. So FDA uses the results from the human abuse liability studies in that subject population as the major basis for the determination of whether the drug is going to be scheduled or not. And you can see a quote here from a presentation by a person from the FDA at a symposium talking about that part of the decision making. So it's important to remember that the DORAs are also Schedule 4. Another point that FDA brought to bear at this particular symposium is that what was seen in the human abuse liability studies was not matching what was seen in the real world as far as abuse of drugs in the DORA class. So just here's a comparison of the abuse potential for the Z drugs and the DORAs, showing that there are differences in the different factors that go into the decision making for scheduling, and pointing out that in some cases there's very limited data for the DORAs, and especially for trazodone. yet the DORAs and the Z drugs are all in Schedule 4. So to sum up, there are global initiatives to decrease the use of benzodiazepines and Z drugs as therapeutic in the treatment of patients with insomnia. But insomnia is a chronic disorder, so other treatments need to be available for patients. CBTI, we're learning more and more about the effectiveness of CBTI, and one would look for studies in the future about patients who are discontinuing the use of benzodiazepines or Z drugs and being treated with CBTI afterwards. But the important consequence of this of the desire not to prescribe them or to deprescribe them is that there's an increase in the use of trazodone. So trazodone, as I showed you, has not been studied in the large-scale trials that one would expect. It's not indicated for insomnia, and we don't know that much about its abuse potential, and it's not necessarily a benign drug, especially in older people. And so the takeaway is that there are important differences between the classes, and that given that the human abuse liability studies may not match what's happening in the real world, that some consideration might be given to examining the scheduling decisions in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thank you. I think we're going to ask all the speakers from this session to come up for the panel.